Hello, my name is Olu Osha, and I'm continuing with my discussion regarding the conflict between U.S. capitalism and uh, the USSR's communism. Um, in an earlier video, I had talked about how a paragon of U.S. capitalism, Andrew Carnegie, whose biography I read when I was wrongfully detained in Montgomery County, Maryland. The biography was excellently written by Peter Crass, if you can get a hold of the book. Um, Andrew Carnegie, who represents capitalism, you can see him embracing elements of socialism or Marxism, right? Marxism, and that's free public education. One of the tenets of Karl Marx's philosophy was having access, children having access to free public education, even up to the university level, because again, Marx stated that the bourgeois capitalist society, with the ownership of the uh, uh, of property by the bourgeois class, uh, they are the only ones who are able to properly educate their children because they have the means, and they help them to continue to have control of the means of production, to the detriment of the proletariat, the working class, who has no property, and all they have is their labor. They can only sell their labor at a very marginal rate, and so they don't get the fair value because the bourgeois class are squeezing out, the real value of their labor in order to maximize the profits that they can make in order to accumulate wealth. And we see that Andrew Carnegie, who became the richest man, one of the richest men in America, with his ownership of Carnegie Steel, uh, was able to do this. But even still, Andrew Carnegie himself, when he was a working boy, when he was a kid in Pennsylvania, he was a working boy. He didn't have a formal education, but he educated himself by making use of a local library. So every time he'd work, he would go and spend his free time in a local library, reading, developing himself, borrowing books. But his free access, when he was denied, he actually wrote an impassioned missive arguing that working boys should have free access to these subscription libraries. And when he became wealthy, the richest man in America, he left 90% of his wealth to fund universities and to fund free public libraries. Right, we have a lot of free public libraries in America. We owe that to Andrew Carnegie. And I mentioned that a university I went to in Nigeria, where I got an excellent education studying history, and it wasn't a Marxist school like in America. They make it seem like if you study Marxism, you're Marxist. No, an educated person studies everything. So Nigeria was neither Marxist nor capitalist. I'd say they run a mixed economy, like Britain, like UK, like Sweden. They had a mixed economy, right? So Andrew Carnegie's money through the Carnegie Corporation gave my university about $2 million, and of course I had an excellent education. That was where I was able to. I read more, there, back when I was in Nigeria, than I have done here in America. Right, that was where I learned to. I read Das Kapital. I read Communist Manifesto. I read all these different dogmas. And of course, in my own home, I was fortunate that my dad had a library in my home, built us a library, and I had a well-stocked, extensive library in my home growing up in Nigeria. So, but my point was that Andrew Carnegie is embraced elements of what people would call Marxism or Karl Marx's philosophy, that there should be free public education. And of course, the capitalists, or Milton Friedman's capitalism, would say no. They'd say that, well, that only there should be private ownership of everything. Let the free markets, operate. Competition, and things like that. On the other hand, now Marxism, however, of course, has its downsides, right? Marxism, um, and was espousing this statelessness, right? A stateless, uh, a stateless society, a classless society, which is kind of Pollyannish, um, where again using the Christian credo dogma of from each according to his ability, where property goods are taken from each according to their ability and distributed to each according to their need. Of course, that's utopian, and a stateless, classless society where there's no ownership, private ownership of property. There's no government ownership of property. Property is owned by the society, shared together, by the society from each according to their ability to each according to their need. Um, Again, how was this practical? How was this to be practicalized? This was left to Lenin, in his Marxist Leninist dogma. Um, Before I get into what happened, I'm going to refer us to, I like books, of course. While I was wrongfully detained, I read George Orwell again. There are two of his books that I'd read before. I reread them. One of them was 1984, uh, and 1984 was portraying the surveillance, the police state, and I realized, during my wrongful detention, that because that the police state was not only referring to communist USSR but the US as well, because we became a police state, a surveillance state during the Cold War, and we are a police state, a surveillance state today. I think the most heavily surveilled place in the world might be Washington D.C. So we're living in a surveilling state as well. The sort that and of course there's a lot of disinformation now. There's a lot of propaganda. There's a lot of deception, and uh, there's a loss of the identity, the individualism, loss of autonomy that we're seeing, that I've been experiencing. From my experience in Montgomery County, they've been challenging, violating my rights of autonomy in the state of Maryland, and this is supposed to be America. So I read that book again while I was wrongfully detained. That's 1984, and I saw it. That wow, that I never thought of 1984 as referring to America. Because I read 1984 in America, but I was thinking that Orwell was talking about uh, uh, you know the USSR. But from my experience being wrongfully detained, the attempts by the state and the judge to violate my rights of autonomy, I came to see that wow, that even though we have the Bill of Rights, it says in America we can't do that. A judge can't do that. The state can't do that. And just the corruption of the public corruption that we thought was part of the USSR or communist state. And I'm seeing it actually going on here. And they're gaslighting, the use of gaslighting by state agents. It was just horrible. The attempt at an extrajudicial killing, the way the state assaulted me in my own home, violated my rights of my usufructuary rights. That's the right to enjoy, my place, right to enjoy a place I'm renting or leasing from, to enjoy the property that I'm renting. All of these things were violated, and I came to see that George Orwell was uh, doing an allegory of the United States as well in 1984, and of course. With regard to what happened in the USSR, I also read, Animal Farm, which was an anthropomorphic, you know, book. Anthropomorphic, anthropomorphism or anthropomorphic means when an author um, uh, uh, represents human characteristics, uh, in an animal or inanimate objects, and that was what George Orwell did brilliantly in Animal Farm. I can't get tired of reading that book. I read it several times, and so it was an allegory of the USSR, of the communist revolution and what happened subsequently. And so in Animal Farm, the animals on a farm were supposed to be depicting the were supposed to be representing the working class or the peasants in the case of Russia, because the majority were the peasants. They weren't the working class. The working class were in the minority. And remember, Lenin, in his own dogma, he said they could skip the the industrialization, the industrial height, to execute a communist revolution, a revolution of the working class, and they could actually do a revolution of the working class without the working class, that they can have peasants who were in the majority. There was a small group of working class people, and he also included an enlightened uh, an intelligentsia class, a bourgeois intelligentsia class, who would be the vanguard, and of course that they didn't have any bourgeois leanings or bourgeois tendencies, and they would guide the peasants who weren't really educated or anything like that, and they would chaperone the sort of guide the the dictatorship of the proletariat, the working class, into a communist regime. So in Animal Farm, we see that wasn't what happened, right? The utopia that Marx or Lenin that Marx originally had propounded did not happen, right? It didn't. It just didn't happen. Or the internationalization of the dictatorship of the proletariat, it didn't happen, and we can see George Orwell captures it very remarkably in his book, the anthropomorphic book, Animal Farm. So again, the animals represented the working class, and they were oppressed and exploited by the humans. The humans, of course, represented the bourgeois, right? The animals were supposed to be the proletariat, and they were exploited and abused. And one day, the animals revolted, and they drove away the human beings who were the bourgeois. And so the animals were supposed to be ruling themselves, but there was this sect, this cabal that led. They were a cabal of pigs. They were swine, and these swine they had their different colors. One of them was called Napoleon. I can't remember the name of the other pig, a very brilliant one. But uh, Orwell remarkably allegorized these these animals to represent, to capture the friction that developed after the Bolshevik Revolution. You could see it as the infighting between the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks. It's funny, the Bolsheviks meant majority, even though they were actually the minority, right? They were less in the party, and the Mensheviks meant minority, even though the Mensheviks were actually more. But eventually, the Bolshevik would defeat the Mensheviks. But within the Bolshevik faction as well, Lenin, of course, was the intellectual leader. He was a firebrand. He was a leader, but he would die shortly after of a brain hemorrhage. And Stalin would successfully manipulate and outmaneuver and eliminate his rivals, including Trotsky, who had been an intellectual contributor and partner with Lenin. Right, Trotsky had a PhD, he was very brilliant, and he had to flee Russia. Eventually, he was killed much years later. He was assassinated by acolytes, by assassins sent by Stalin much years later in Mexico. So you would see one of the swine, a black swine. I think he was the one that was Napoleon. I can't remember. And there was another swine. He had so that swine, that pig, it was really literally a pig. A hog. He had these aides, and they were like Doberman pinchers. They were these dogs, wild dogs, and they were his aides, and you could represent that as the Cheka, or the secret police, state secret police that surrounded Lenin and Stalin, and they used them to eliminate their rivals and to just centralized control and enforce an autocratic rule. And this was what happened. So eventually, an animal farm, the swine became the leader, and of course, it was surrounded by the dogs that guarded it. And eventually, they now started having meetings at the end. One of the animals that was working went and looked, because the swine had now moved into the homes, into the main house where the human beings had lived. And when he was looking in, the animals, the swine, they were now wearing human clothes, right? They were now dressed like humans, even though they were animals, and they were even trying to stand like animals. And they had invited humans back, and they were sitting together, and it ended that you couldn't that the animal couldn't tell the difference between the humans and the animals anymore. And there was also their credo. George Orwell was always very brilliant, using all these creeds, creating creeds and quips. He did that with 1984, and in Animal Farm, it was all animals are equal. That was supposed to be the goal, right? But it ended with all animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. And that was sort of what happened with the communist revolution. And so he was trying to it was a satire on the communist revolution, because at one time George Orwell himself had actually been he had socialist leanings, right? And he'd gone to I've read his homage to Catalonia. He had gone to participate in and attempted in a, was it the Spanish Civil War, they had some kind of socialist uprising, and he'd gone to participate, but he got disillusioned later on, became disenchanted, and of course he wrote those works, satires, sort of criticizing the communists, communist dogma and the communist regimes. So George Orwell was a very brilliant author. I enjoy him, and we see that's kind of what happened in the USSR. Initially Lenin had advocated that the proletariat revolution should be international, but the West, after so initially USSR, Russia, sorry, the Tsarist Russia was involved, was an ally of Britain, and America came in later on against Germany, and Germany's allies. I think they included the Turks, the Ottoman Empire, and however, the communist revolution occurred, the Bolshevik revolution, and Russia came out. Russia was pulled out of the war, and eventually there was the civil war in Russia between the whites and the whites, those who supported the old regime, the bourgeois class, the Tsarist regime. The Tsars were killed, right? The Tsar, the Romanov family, they were killed, but there were still the aristocrats and the middle class, and they were involved in this war against the Bolsheviks. Bolsheviks were called the Reds. So there was this huge civil war that decimated the Russian populace. And so the West sort of encircled Russia, but eventually Russia shut itself up, and they stopped, the attempts to internationalize the communist revolution from Russia, to spread it globally, because one, Lenin died, and then Stalin took over. Stalin, as I said, got rid of his rivals, outmaneuvered them, including Trotsky and the others. And Stalin was a very deceptive, very cunning guy. As I said, I read the biography of Stalin by Stephen Kotkin. It was very well written. He was a very clever person, and people don't, in practical ways, it was very strategic in a very practical way. He wasn't an intellectual, a fervent intellectual like Lenin or Trotsky, but he was a very intelligent, savvy organizer, right? He was, so he got rid of his rivals, and of course, he focused on on communism in one state, in Russia, in the USSR and its satellites. He focused on that. Yeah, and then so because he became very paranoid that the whole international community was going to was going to just gang up against USSR, which they did, of course, and so they came up, Lenin as well. I guess he came up with what's called autarky. Autarky is the policy of self-government, being self-sufficient, a country being able to support itself, govern itself, produce everything it needs without relying on imports or associating with economy with foreign countries, foreign governments. It's just to be self-supporting. And so Stalin went into this dreadful collectivization because he also wanted to rapidly develop the USSR, and he got into this competition with the capitalist world, with the West. And the idea was to constantly try and show that communism, the war of ideology came up, to constantly show that communism, socialism was a better ideology than what they had in a capitalist society, that they could outdo the West technologically, they could outdo the West, in standard of living and everything. And so they were the two superpowers now, and through espionage, right, through defectors and Soviet infiltrators, and during the Manhattan Project and later on, they were able to gain access to nuclear technology. And 5 years after America dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which ended the Second World War, the USSR were able to make their own atomic bombs as well, their own nuclear bombs. And so they're able to catch up with the West. And eventually they even got into a technological war with the US, and they launched Sputnik in October 1957. I think it was October 4, 1957. They launched Sputnik, which was a satellite system they launched into into space. And so US of course got panicked, and they realized that Soviet Russia could actually be surveilling them from out of space. And so America got into this technological war with the USSR. And so that's how the Cold War, the espionage wars, were going on. And of course, I'm going to stop here, and I'll organize, my thoughts later on. But importantly, as I was saying earlier, that if we analyze these nations, right, despite their doctrinaire differences, we will find that both nations embraced elements like American capitalism. Society embraces elements of socialism, and for instance, the USSR engaged in these 5-year plans, collectivization, because the government now organized the economy, planning and everything. There was a government state control of the economy and planning. The US got into it later on, or companies started doing it. The US focused on the economy being driven by the private sector. Now, Lenin and Stalin, they moved away from the ideal of Karl Marx, that we should have a stateless society, that the state nobody should own property, there should be a classless society. We would find out that under Stalin, the state came to control property, came to own the property in the states. And you see the war against the kulaks. The kulaks were these peasants who owned, wealthy peasants in Russia at the time. And Stalin's forces sort of waged a war against them because there was a lot of poverty, a lot of famine during the early development of during the Soviet rise under the Stalinist era. And he was forcing Russia to industrialize using a process of collectivization, and his very aggressive draconian 5-year plans. He had these production levels. He forced the economy, the government, to meet every 5 years just to be able to compete with the West. And it caused a lot of havoc at the time. But again, you will find that uh, even America, right, during the Great Depression and under FDR, they would employ what was called as the Keynesian economics, based on the philosophy, the political and economic theory of the British economist John Maynard Keynes, which advocates a mixed economy and which says in a time of economic crisis, right, it's saying that the um, the, the government should intervene in the economy. They could use mechanisms of taxing as a mechanism, right? And they should buy goods. They should buy goods. They should intervene. They should help private business and things like that. So the Keynesian economics was what FDR uh, employed during the era of the Great Depression to basically solve the Great Depression. So you see the New Deal packages, the New Deal programs uh, created by FDR. These were they had elements of Marxism, of socialism, right? So we see that uh, the West adopts elements of socialism, and there's just like in Sweden. Sweden has a mixed economy. I was talking about Nigeria. Nigeria, we had a great public uh, school system because Nigeria is, when I was growing up, it was amongst the top five biggest oil producers in the world. Till today, it's amongst the top 10 biggest oil. It has amongst the top 10 largest oil reserves in the world. Liquefied natural gas. Some people say that might be a reason why President Donald Trump, number 45 and number 47, all of a sudden is interested in helping the Christians who have been attacked by Islamist terrorists, or let me call them Boko Haram. They're not true Muslims. For about almost 20 years now, since the 2000s, since the noughties, right? And America had never interceded in the past, but all of a sudden, number 45 and 47 is interested in intervening. Just as some have said that America is interested in Venezuela's, not America, but 45, 47, and maybe some other business interest might be interested in Venezuela's largest proven oil reserves. Right, Venezuela has the largest proven oil reserves in the world, larger than any country in the Middle East, right? And Nigeria is amongst the top 10 as well, apart from it having other resources, gold, so many diverse other untapped resources, right? And so um, these, back to what I was saying, in any event, these two countries, right, embraced elements of each nation's opposing dogma. Right? Capitalism had elements of the American economy embraced elements of socialism. We saw it through FDR's programs, and today now things that Karl Marx was advocating, the abolition of child labor. FDR, effected this. We have, child labor is no longer allowed. And better working conditions. We have free public education at elementary. Many states have this free public education at elementary and secondary school, high school level, middle school, high school level. These are things that Karl Marx was advocating in his theories. So you see, we have these elements as well, and of course there's the even in today, at some point, even Lenin started to allow, and Stalin as well. They started to allow private ownership of capital and property and business, to encourage private business people, because to address the famine, right? Because they had the skills to incentivize the kulaks. They called them the kulaks at that time, to own their farms, individual ownership and to have to make profits, to be moved to be incentivized by the profits motive, because that's a cornerstone of capitalism, as espoused by classical economics, right? Uh, the profit motive, right? The profit motive is a cornerstone of uh, capitalist, the capitalist capital classical capitalism, right? The profit motive, private ownership of capital, and the an unregulated, less federal government intervention and regulation, and the primacy of free market system. Uh, in any event, let me stop here, and I'll continue with my discussion on, the doctrinaire differences between the USA and the USSR, which fueled the espionage wars, the Cold War, which eventually led to the unfortunate assassination of President John F. Kennedy. Again, my name is Olu Osha. I also draw attention to color of law violations, pivoting on subordination of perjury and fraud on the courts, intended to obstruct justice in federal government, equal employment opportunity complaints, and inspector general complaints, and office of special counsel complaints. I filed against some senior leaders and colleagues in the Department of Defense and Department of the Navy. Uh, so I was swatted on May 16, 2023, and I was wrongfully detained in order to discredit me and to impede, my complaint in the federal government. I was doing the right thing. I'm an American citizen, and I was doing my job, doing the right thing, reporting fraud and misconduct in the federal government, in the Department of Defense and Department of the Navy. Unfortunately, the people I reported orchestrated and engineered a swatting, which is a federal crime. It's criminal, it's illegal. I'm hoping to get justice. As Martin Luther King is supposed to have said, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. I'll keep you posted. Thank you.